In Chapter 5, we focus on how to manage all of the data that's out there. You may recall from the first week, one of the things we covered is that we start with raw data that then, after some manipulation, can be turned into information, and then through further analysis becomes knowledge. And as was mentioned at the time, the real issue we have is that in today's environment, there is so much data. How can you find the stuff that you really want as opposed to all the stuff that is irrelevant to the task that you're working on? This has been created because of the amount of data that's being created. Listed here on the screen, you've got credit cards, emails, digital video, RFID tags, which we'll talk about in a later chapter, digital video surveillance. Remember a couple of weeks ago we looked at the number of CCTVs that are out there. And then all of medical devices. I listed here just radiology scans, but everything that's done in a hospital is digitized. All that information, those when you have a procedure done, everything, that all creates data. The estimate, and I have no clue on how anyone calculated this to come up with this, but somebody made an estimate that over 1 zettabyte of new data is created each year. And so the first question is, what the heck is a zettabyte? Well, you can see here we start a kilobyte as 1,000, and a byte is just it's pretty much the smallest form of useful information. Megabyte is 1,000. Hello? Oh, hi. Oh. Right. Okay. Yes. Okay. I'll see how it works. Thanks. Okay. Perfect. Bye. And as you see, we go down through gigabyte, terabyte, petabyte, exabyte, and finally a zettabyte. So what does 1,000 exabytes look like? Well, here it is, a 1 followed by all these zeros. That's 1 zettabyte. So still, that's how do you get your hands around it? How much is that? Well, that would roughly be if you had everyone in the world continually posting on Twitter for 100 years. That's the amount of new raw data created every single year. That's a staggering amount. There's just, it's hard to get your hands around it, your head around it, and grasp how much that is. That is huge. Worse yet is that the amount each year is increasing exponentially. A linear increase would be, okay, it increases 10% each year. Exponentially means the first year it increases 10%, the next year it increases 100%, the next year after that it increases 1,000%. And so you can see it just explodes. This data is scattered throughout businesses within the organization, and it's coming from multiple sources, some internal, some external. So managing that is really complex and difficult. One of the concepts that's important to understand is this idea of data rot. And what's meant there is this is information that is old information. And as data gets old, then there's a possibility that it's no longer valid. The easiest example to think of is your physical address. As a student and a young adult, you may change apartments, cities multiple times until you buy that first house and settle down for a few years. So if someone has a database that has an address for you and the last time that address was updated was 6 years ago, how likely is that that's still accurate? Or is it out of date? That's data rot. As time goes on, some data, the accuracy becomes questionable. Now, some data doesn't change. Manufacturing process, you had 96% acceptance rate on the production run from last week. That's not going to change over time. That's just a historical fact. But other information, addresses, even names, people change their names, phone numbers, that's all subject to data rot. And of course, when we have all this data, as we've talked about in class already, data security, the integrity of that data is really crucial. And how do you keep control of that? That's a very challenging issue for business and for IT. What happens is that internally in an organization, we have multiple sources for information. Manufacturing may generate some information, sales generates some information, engineering generates information, and they may be dealing with some of the same elements, but if their systems don't communicate with each other, they can get out of sync with each other. And we'll look more detail in that in an example in the video in the in-class session. And then we throw on top of that all the federal regulations. You've probably heard about the HIPAA laws. Those deal with medical records, and they have very specific requirements for what information can be released about you, your medical records, and to whom, under what conditions. Likewise, there's a set of regulations, it's called FERPA, that deals with student information. So your grades, your attendance in class, who can that be released to and who can it not be released to, under what conditions, and so forth. So there's other regulations that as businesses we have to pay attention to. So the way to deal with some of these issues, in particular the inconsistent data, is this concept of master data. And so this is information, or I should say data, and I apologize for using the terms interchangeably when they really aren't. You will find that people do that in business. A lot of times they talk about information when they're really talking about data. Be that as it may, that you have core data that covers all of the different departments. Engineering has a part number. Manufacturing needs to use the same part number. Finance needs to use that same part number for tracking costs. So it spans across multiple areas in the business. Master data management is how do you keep that data accurate, and so that one group doesn't make a change that the other groups don't know about. And again, we'll see an example of that in the in-class portion for this chapter. So here's a very simple example of what can go wrong as you work on an assignment for a class. So you start on your home computer, you edit the assignment, then you pack up. You're going to go to school, so you copy the assignment to your USB drive, take your USB drive, copy it onto the laptop, then you do some further edits on the laptop, then you copy it back down to your USB drive, and then finally you edit it again on the USB using the college computer. Now the problem is we've created multiple versions of this same document. Started with the first rev, then we ended up with a second rev, and then finally a third rev. How do we make sure that those all stay synchronized so that we don't accidentally end up working on Rev 1 when we should be working on Rev 3? This is a very simple example. In business, it gets very complicated when you have dozens of people working on the same set of data. So what's one answer, especially for us as individuals? The cloud. If the information is stored to the cloud, then everyone who edits it, it's making changes to it in one specific location. The problem when you copy something down to a USB drive and then update and make changes on that is, did you get it synced back to the source location? Or have you now created a standalone piece of information? There's some really great, simple, inexpensive tools to use for that. For personal use, of course, we have Google Drive, as well as Microsoft has what they call OneDrive, where you can make it very easy to make sure that it's always synchronized, so that even if you don't have internet connection right at the moment, you can make changes on your document, and then as soon as you get internet connection restored, it will automatically update the cloud version. If you hear the term database management systems, you see this right here. This is just a system that manages, this is the core data that's over to the right, and each of these departments over here needs some of this information, but not access to everything. And so the database management system will determine who gets access to what, and it makes sure that everyone is working off of just one centralized repository for the data so that it's always consistent. When we're talking about data hierarchy, this goes from the top down to the bottom. This is from the lowest, smallest portion, and then each gets bigger. So we'll look at what each of these terms mean. A bit in the digital world is just either a 0 or 1. That's all it can be. It's like a light switch. It's either on or off, period. So it can only tell you that small piece of information. Now, if we string a group of those together, you end up with a byte, which is 8 bits. And of those ones and zeros, there's 256 possible combinations. And listed below are some of the characters on a keyboard and what their corresponding byte would look like, made up of ones and zeros. Now, it always cracks me up. Engineers have kind of a geeky humor, and sometimes they deal with not a full 8 bits of information, but only 4 bits for certain things. And so if a byte is 8 bits, what would you call only 4 bits? Engineers call it a nibble. So instead of a byte, you're only taking a nibble. Again, that's geeky humor. So here's a field and record. So you can see it says right here, database record. This entire, all the data listed on here is called one record. Each of the rows is one field. So we have a field that's the SKU number, and there's the value associated with that. We have another field that's the sale price. So that's what a field and record in a database looks like. When we design a database, there's a couple of ways of doing it. One is called the data model, and this is where you start with, okay, we have an entity. In this case, the entity is our customer. This could be Bob's Auto Parts. And then within that, associated with that customer, that entity, we have attributes: address, phone, email, payment terms, all kinds of different attributes associated with that customer. And then we have to have a primary key. This is a unique identification number. Now, maybe we do business around the entire United States, and there's a Bob Auto Parts in Portland. Well, there's also a Bob Auto Parts in Seattle, Bob Auto Parts in Spokane, Bob's Auto Parts in Chicago. So how do we know which Bob's Auto Parts we're dealing with. And that's when you assign a customer number, customer ID, that is unique to each entity. So even if the name up here on the entity is exactly the same, you have a unique identifier for that. Most common one that you're used to dealing with, there's two of them. One is your social security number is unique to you, and also your PCC student ID is unique to you. That's a unique identifier. That's a primary key that's used in the PCC database, is your student ID number. Now you can also have secondary keys associated with a particular entity. For example, are they a wholesale customer or retail customer? Are they located in the United States or are they outside the United States? And the reason for creating secondary keys is that it can reduce the amount of time required when you do searches and you want to do sorts on some key attributes like this, wholesale versus retail, and so forth. So it's part of when you design the database. If you know that you're going to want to do a lot of reports where you can differentiate the wholesale from the retail, you build that in as a secondary key. Another aspect of setting up the database is this idea of the entity relationship. So when you hear that term, entity relationship or ER, this is looking at how do the entities and attributes relate to each other. For example, you can have one-to-one. So one student can have one parking permit. You can have one-to-many. This is an instructor can have multiple classes, but each class only has one instructor normally, although there are a few classes you will find that have two instructors doing team teaching. And lastly, you can have many-to-many. So a student can have multiple classes, and each class can have multiple students. It's important when designing a database to understand those types of relationships so that you correctly structure it. Now, this is not a course on how to set up databases and construct them, but just to be aware of that, that's some of the considerations that a designer of a database has to think about when they create it so that you have an easy to use database. Unfortunately, you will find a lot of the databases existing within business were not set up correctly, and so it can be very difficult to generate reports because it wasn't structured right in the first place. You'll hear the term flat file. So the easiest way is, let's just take a quick look at what a flat file is. I'll pull up what's used mostly for flat files. I'll have to drag it over here so you can see it. Is an Excel spreadsheet. This is just a very simple flat file. Now, to show you, for example, if we were going to create this as a table, we might break it up into different tabs that would allow us to do that. And actually, we'll look at a better example of that in a minute. But Excel is the tool that is used most likely for a flat file, and that's the simplest form of a database where you just list all the occurrences. Now, the problem with the flat file is that you can have the same information keyed in multiple times, and anytime you key in the exact same information, it's easy to make a typo on one of the items, and so you have a mistake that's created. And like I said, we'll look at ways around that here in a moment. Relational database models, you'll hear that term, two-dimensional tables, but what you hear mostly talked about today is SQL database, structured query language. I really like SQL because it makes it very easy for the average user to quickly create reports exactly the way they want it. So like here, you say select. That's a verb. Okay, I can understand that. I'm telling the database to choose, to select all the entries where the student name is equal to Bob Jones. And I want to get that information from, because I have to tell it where to look, the student database. And here's the criteria where the grade point is greater than 3.6. So this example is going to give me a list of all the student names located in the student database where their grade point average is greater than 3.6. Very simple and easy to construct a report and get the output you're looking for. Now, another way you can do it is what's called query by example. And this is where you have a form that's predetermined. Here it's got student name, student ID, grade point, email, major, and address. And I just enter into these fields what I want to use as my filters. So I want here a list of all the student names, and it'll give me the student IDs, emails, all the information that's listed up here, but only if their grade point is greater than 3.6, and in this example, and only if their major is business. Query by example can be very useful too, especially if you're doing this multiple times. So you set this up once, now I can go in and change the grade point to 3.0, or I can change the major to chemistry. And so on this form, I can very quickly adjust the report I'm looking for. Normalization is a way that we handle and take that flat file database and say, we want to create this, turn this into a relational database, and it's streamlined so that we're reducing redundancies and we're helping to ensure the accuracy and the ease of using it. So, for example, we'll just skip through this. Here, go right to the example. Here's our kind of traditional flat file, non-normalized database. And as we look down here, you can see hood, 2 times. I've got the part number, the unit, supplier, that exact same information I've had to key in multiple times. Or looking over here, notice this. The supplier name, AA Automotive, the address, all that information, I've got it appearing 4 times in a row, exact same information that someone had to key in. And it's easy to make a mistake when you do that. So instead, what we do is we break this up, that first one. So we go back to here, instead of having just one screen, one what's called table, we're going to split it up into 3 tables. And so now we have customer 121 placed an order on January 15th, 2006. All we enter in for a customer is 121. That's our unique customer identifier number. And then it comes down here to the customer table and it looks up and says, who is 121? Well, 121 is J. Smith. There's the address. And it pulls the information from that. So let's look at another example. Here we've got parts and we split the part. So we've got a part number, and then we've got the part description and price and the supplier that's associated with that part number. So 1699, when we place an order, our order 13, all we do is enter in part number 1699, and it's going to pull all of that information from the part table. And 1699 only appears in this table once. We'll skip over that slide. So data warehousing. When you hear the term data warehousing or data marts, all that's really referring to is that we've taken all the organization's data, put it in a central location. This can be an off-site location, and we're giving remote access to that data for whoever's authorized to it. And so we've got all this data stored in one central repository. Now with the cloud, that we're getting more of this being distributed to where it looks like we're dealing with one data warehouse, but the actual data may be stored across multiple servers and multiple locations around the country. And so with the relational database, you can see here we have the same information, but for years 2003, 2004, 2005. And the way you can think of this, it's like a three-dimensional with the years, and we've got all the different information shown that way. And of course, multi-dimensional, it can be more than 3 dimensions. It can be a lot of dimensions. It's hard to visually picture how that is, but it's just the idea that it allows us to easily be able to look at what happened in 2005 or what happened in 2003. Or we can look at specifics. We can go this way, like what happened in the central region with washers across those 3 years. Obviously, the benefits of data warehousing is that the people that need access to the data can get at it very simply from web browsers, and they know that it's the correct data because there's only one place to go for the data. They don't have to worry about inconsistent data that has not been synchronized. One thing to remember, however, is that people around the country, and as we're dealing in global environments, people around the world do not have the same access to high-speed bandwidth. So you may have to think about breaking up a database into smaller groupings of data for those people that need to access it where they don't have high bandwidth, so that when it's doing a search or downloading information, it is not as much information to deal with. Let's see, let's go to the next one. Yes. Now, we've been talking about data management, but there's also this idea of knowledge management. And the way to think about this is like when you look at an iceberg, you have the stuff above the waterline. That's the explicit knowledge that is well documented within the organization. So that's the engineering drawing that says exactly what the part is supposed to be in the dimensions. It's the manufacturing process sheets that tell you do this, and and it gives you the sequence and what equipment and what tools to use. But then there's tacit knowledge below the waterline, or you might hear this referred to as tribal knowledge. And in most organizations, the tacit knowledge is actually many times larger than the explicit knowledge. And yet it's really important to the organization. This is the kind of information that when you lose someone who's been the machine operator for 20 years, you lose all that knowledge that they have gained over those 20 years of how to make the machines work just right. And the new person coming in following the process sheets doesn't get the same results. That's because the seasoned employee knew that if I'm using press number 2, what I need to do is I need to let it warm up for 15 minutes, then do a reset, and then do 10 scrap parts in rapid succession, and then it'll be stable and I'll produce good parts from the beginning. Whereas the new person taking the process sheet turns on the machine, starts making parts, and the first 10 or 20 are bad. So how do we capture that knowledge? Because in today's workforce and climate, people change jobs. That tribal knowledge walks out the door and it's gone. One of the common ways of doing it in business is the use of wiki pages. And this is nothing more than, it's like a bulletin board, whiteboard, where people can post, hey, I found that with machine number 2, if I do this, this, and this, it seems to work better. But on machine number 4, you don't need to do that. And machine number 6 needs a different process to get it up and stable. And so it's a way that employees can very quickly add their experience, their knowledge, and document it in a way that other people can access it using the search tools built into the wiki devices. And of course, the most famous or infamous wiki that we're all familiar with is Wikipedia. And the problem that we have with business wikis as well as with Wikipedia is it's so easy for people to post information, and there's no process in place for that information to be validated and certified that yes, it is correct. We're relying upon the users. If an employee posts a process that as the supervisor, I look at it and say, you know, if you do that, that's dangerous, that I will go in and change it and say, no, don't do that. You know, so we're relying on the fact that the community will police these and keep them accurate. And that's a big assumption. But a lot of businesses make use of internal wiki pages as a way of trying to capture this tacit knowledge. That's all I wanted to talk to you about on data knowledge and management. We'll look at some videos in the classroom. But now I want to transition on to another topic, PowerPoint presentations. So here's a question for you. What's the biggest mistake people make in their, when they do their PowerPoint presentations? Spelling errors, talking too long, not addressing audience's concerns, not practicing, too much animation, reading slides, or all of the above. And I think you would all get this one correct. The answer is all of the above. So we're going to talk about some things not to do as well as some things that you should do in presentations. So this is adapted from some material I found by Dustin Wax. And so as I stress in the assignments, you always want to give credit where credit is due, and there's a full citation at the end of this. The challenge we have is that most people in business, when they get invited to a meeting with a presentation, what they're thinking is, oh boy, here's a waste of time when I could be doing something productive. I've got to sit through another boring presentation. You do not want your presentations to be boring. You want them to be engaging with your audience. So what can you do so that you're not another boring presenter? First off, write a script. The sad thing is that most presentations are created without starting with an outline. And it shows. Start with an outline. Write out what you intend to say and cover, and that will then drive you what your slides look like. But don't start creating the slides at the beginning. Start with the outline, what you're going to say, and then create the slides. Remember to start your presentation with a beginning. You have to have an opening. This is BA131. We talk about that a lot, that you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Make sure your audience knows that you've arrived at the end of the presentation. One thing that you want to do is keep your audience focused. If you display a screen all at once and there's 6 bullet points on the screen, you're talking about bullet point 1. Where is your audience looking? Well, some of them are looking and reading bullet point 1. Some of them are reading bullet point 2. Some are on 3, 4, 5, and 6, and so on. Your audience is all over the place as to what they're focused on while you're trying to talk to them about bullet point number 1. PowerPoint has a built-in feature that allows you to animate and determine when the items come up. As you notice, like on this slide, first I talked about writing a script, that's all you could see. Now I'm talking about one thing at a time, that's all you can see. Now we're going to move on to number 3, no paragraphs. Those are examples of using PowerPoint's animation so I can control what you're able to see at any given time. Also, the point of PowerPoint is not to be wordy. It's not a report. It's not a memo. No paragraphs. Most of the time, you do not have complete sentences. You're just going to have snippets. You're going to have thoughts, and you talk to the thoughts. The point of the presentation, displaying something up there, is just to help your audience stay focused and also to help you remember what you're going to, what you want to talk about. So the bullets are just that, just talking points. Now, when you're making your presentation, ideally, and we'll see in a video that I'll show you in class, you want to be looking at your audience. You want to have eye contact. But if you're not really confident with what you intend to say, you can use note cards if necessary. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the classroom session. You do need to pay attention to the design of your PowerPoint slides themselves. For example, avoid the temptation to use some of PowerPoint's effects. Some of them are really cheesy. Now, they can be appropriate for a specific point that you're trying to make, but just be careful about using them. You want to focus on simple design basics. For example, the fonts that you choose. Now, can everyone read that really clearly? Use sans serifs like Arial, Helvetica, and Calibri. Actually, it works much better, isn't it? As you see how much easier this is to read than this. What they have found in doing studies is that it's much easier for people to read dark text on a light background. Now, for some examples, certain industries, you may have a corporate style guide that requires you to use a dark background, and that's okay. But if you do use a dark background, you want to make sure that your text is very light. Make sure it's white, not gray, and increase the font size, 1 or 2 from what you would normally do. Again, you need to have that clear contrast so that people, even in the back of the room, can easily read what's on the screen. Only align your text either left or right. Don't use centered text except for headings. Centered text is just harder to read. We're used to reading left justified text. Avoid clutter. White space, which is a term from publishing industry, all this area out here where there's nothing on it, white space is good. Makes things clean, clear, easy to read, easy to follow, to stay focused. So when you're looking at your slide, ask yourself, does that piece of information, that word, that graphic, does it need to be there? If not, you may want to consider taking it off so that you have lots of white space. With that, images are great. You want to take a boring presentation, spruce it up a little bit, add some pictures. They can be very engaging, or they can be a distraction. And we'll look at some of when we get to the actual presentations themselves, and things that you can do with your images to make them fit into the presentation much easier. You'll notice on this image, how big is the image? Where is, can you tell where the square box is? No, because the background of the image is the same color as the background on the slide. this is ideal. This is what you want so that it's just there on the screen. It's not an obvious square block that's been inserted. One caution, PowerPoint has some simplistic built-in clip art. Stay away from that. Do a search on the internet, find the clip art you want. There's lots of free, royalty-free, license-free clip art out there that you can use. So far, we've been talking about PowerPoint itself, but your presentation is not just the slides that are being shown up on the screen. Your posture, how do you stand? We'll look at videos that shows some of the key attributes of your posture. What do you do with your hands and so forth? Your dress. You should dress appropriately to your audience. If your audience is a bunch of investment bankers, well, that's probably business professional attire. If you're making a presentation to the factory workers, well, maybe you want to dress business casual. Choose your attire to your audience. Think about being mobile as you're doing your presentation. You don't want to be stuck in one spot with your feet nailed to the ground. You want to be able to freely have some motion around. And we'll see that in one of the sample videos I show you in class. When you start your presentation, it's really helps if you start off with a hook. Something surprising or intriguing. It might be an outrageous statement. Start your presentation saying, the best thing to do for this division would be to close it down and sell off all the inventory. Everybody's going, what? What are you talking about? Then you go and you say, then you can continue on with something like, that's what you might think with just a cursory glance. But as I'm going to show you throughout the rest of this presentation, we have a very solid business unit here. We need to do some changes, some tweaking to the approach, but this is a gold mine for the company. Okay, now you got their attention. Ask questions. Nobody wants to sit in a presentation for an hour and just listen to you drone on talking about stuff. See if you can find questions to ask. For example, last week I asked you and I said, has anyone been the victim of identity theft? Someone raised their hand. I pointed them. So what happened? Tell us what happened. So you want to ask your audience questions. That will pique people's interest, their curiosity, and it helps keep them engaged. And like this point says, you want to have a dialogue, a little brief dialogue. Ask the audience, how many people have heard about or understand what's involved in the life cycle testing that our product goes through? Joe, can you tell the rest of them, what's an average life cycle consist of? How long does it take to do that? And you get them going. Say, have you had problems with that? You can take a little bit of a side tour to get a little bit of back and forth dialogue going on. When you're talking, one of the problems that can happen, especially if you're nervous, is that you can start talking in this monotone robotic voice that doesn't vary, and it's very boring and puts people to sleep. What you want to do is be real. Just talk like you were speaking to a friend. This is why it's so important that you know your material so that you can just be natural. Just talk as if it's no big deal. You're having a phone conversation with someone. Don't get trapped into reading off your index cards, because if you do that, you will tend to fall into that flat, monotone, fixed voice. And the way you get there, practice, 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 until you are so confident of what you want to say that it's just easy. No sweat, no big deal. And that when you have that level of confidence in your material, you will come across very natural. Now, for those of you that are not comfortable speaking in front of groups of individuals, there's a group called Toastmasters. All major cities have them, and it's just a group of people that get together and lunch, and they will have individual members come up and do, a 2-minute talk, very short talks. You're never criticized, judged. It's just an opportunity for you to get up in front of people and find out, I can get up and talk about something that I understand, and it's no big deal. We'll actually look at a video about that in class. Lastly, and I love the fact that Dustin did this, he put his number 10, his last tip was go ahead and break. Ignore any of the previous 9. It's okay to break the rules. There's always an exception. However, there needs to be a good reason to break the rule. If you intentionally have a reason why you want to use a dark background instead of a light, fine, do it. But do it because you have an underlying reason and you've thought it through and said, yes, I know that normally they say this works best, but in this case, we're going to do it this way. If you ignore the rules when you break, or you just haven't paid any attention, what that's going to lead to is the shoddy, boring presentations that first slide started with that everybody dreads. So listen to Dustin's 1 through 9. You should use those 99% of the time, but for that 1%, go ahead and do something different. Now, I thought Dustin did a good job of capturing most of it, but I want to add on. I want to piggyback on a few of my own that I think he could have added to his list. So I'm actually upping it to 14 tips. So the next tip that I'm adding is spelling and grammar. It's so easy to spell check. That will take care of 90% of your problems. But then you need to proofread and look for, possible awkward wording, other, words that could, would work better that a spell check may not find for you. If you're not a good proofreader, it's always a good idea to have someone else with a fresh set of eyes look it over. The bottom line is you don't want to look foolish. November 31st. Problem with November 31st? There's only 30 days in November. I started out my presentation to senior management, room full of 200 people, the CEO sitting in the back of the room. First slide, I had November 31st on it, and the CEO from the very back of the room yelled out in a loud voice, "There's no November 31st." Now, I was only just starting my presentation. The entire rest of my presentation was diminished in value. Fortunately, I continued on, but it did detract from the effectiveness of my presentation. So get someone to help you and to proofread to make sure that you don't have any really silly mistakes like that. Consistency is really important in your presentations. Whatever font size, font family you pick, stay with it. Whatever bullets you use, stay with it. Now, there can be reasons that you choose to vary that, but in general, you want to be consistent from slide to slide. Now, the good news is that PowerPoint has a fantastic tool built into it called the Slide Master, where you can define the formatting, the font, when you indent a bullet point and sub-indent it, what happens to the font size and, colors. You can make everything extremely consistent by using the Slide Master tool. If you're not familiar with that, I suggest you either, look at some online videos, tips and techniques and training on PowerPoint, or PCC has class that teach you those more advanced tools in PowerPoint. One thing that people forget about sometimes is that you may want to print out copies of your presentation as handouts. And some of the things that you do in PowerPoint, this particularly comes into play with animations and other things, when you print it out, it may not look the way you want it. So if you're going to do handouts, print one out first and see and make sure every slide comes across correctly the way you want it before you print out a bunch of stuff and realize, oh, wow, you can't really read what's on slide 10 because of the animation. And lastly, and this is really important, you want to watch your time. If the senior management team has given you a 15-minute time slot, you don't want to run 25 minutes. That shows that you're being disrespectful of their time. But if they've given you a half an hour time slot for the presentation and you only use 10 minutes, the message that sends is that you really didn't take it seriously, that you didn't do a thorough analysis, that this is really a shoddy presentation. So understand the time slot you've been given, and then you want to be very close to that. You don't want to go over, and you want to take advantage of all the time that you've been given, so you don't want to go under a lot. So how can you know how long your presentation is going to take? Practice, practice, practice. Time yourself. Do a run through with everything. Don't skip anything. Do it as exactly as you intend to do it in front of an audience. If you're doing a team presentation like we are for this project, you have someone that's the timekeeper that starts and stops, so you know how long it took. And if you find out, wow, we went 5 minutes over, okay, what do we need to take out? Well, gee, you talked an awful long time on that bullet point. Let's condense it down. Don't talk so much. Again, if you started from an outline and you wrote a script, you'll be able to edit and take stuff out so that each time when you do the presentation after you've made a change and decided not to talk so much about that, you don't repeat that and it actually gets inserted back in. So again, the only way to hit that time is through practice. As I mentioned, we will look at some videos in class in more detail on PowerPoint presentations.